Divorce is often spoken about as a legal event, a signature at the end of a long emotional battle, a moment when two people officially separate and move on. But psychologically, divorce is not an ending. It is the beginning of a very specific internal transformation that follows an almost predictable pattern in women after long marriages. This transformation has little to do with courts or paperwork and everything to do with identity. Loss, and the sudden collapse of a structure that once quietly organized daily life. Social media rarely tells this story honestly. What it shows instead is a polished narrative of liberation. Captions announce a rebirth. Photos declare independence, girls' trips, gym selfies, and smiling faces are framed as proof that the woman has finally reclaimed herself and is now living her best life. On the surface, it looks like freedom. Underneath, something far more complicated is unfolding. When a long marriage ends, a woman does not simply lose a partner. She loses a shared language, a shared rhythm, and a shared future that once felt assumed. The home that was built together becomes divided. Sometimes literally, sometimes symbolically. Familiar routines evaporate overnight. There's no longer an automatic we to lean on. Even small moments, like cooking dinner or deciding when to sleep, suddenly feel strangely empty or disturbingly open. This creates a surreal emotional mix that many women struggle to articulate. There is relief, because the tension or dissatisfaction that existed before is finally gone. There is also terror, because the certainty that once anchored life has vanished. Freedom appears at the same time as regret, and excitement exists alongside a quiet sense of loss. Psychologically, this moment feels like standing on the edge of an abyss while being told by everyone around you that you should feel proud of jumping. Externally, people celebrate the courage it takes to leave. Internally, the nervous system is trying to process shock, grief, and the sudden absence of a familiar emotional home. Rooms feel haunted by memories. Objects carry emotional weight. Silence feels louder than arguments ever did. What makes this stage particularly confusing is that none of these feelings cancel each other out. A woman can feel empowered and broken at the same time, hopeful and deeply unsettled in the same breath. This is not about blame or judgment. Divorce can be necessary, even life-saving. But the psychological aftermath is rarely discussed with honesty. What looks like freedom from the outside often feels like free fall on the inside. And to survive that fall, the mind begins doing something very specific, something protective, something that sets the stage for everything that follows. To understand the next phase, we have to look closely at how the mind responds to loss and why it rushes to build a story before the dust has even settled. When a long marriage ends, the human mind does not process the loss in a clean, logical sequence. It moves in loops, fragments, and emotional shortcuts, faced with uncertainty and the collapse of a familiar structure. The psyche urgently searches for meaning. It needs a story, not because the story is perfectly true, but because without one, the emotional weight of the unknown would feel unbearable. This is where the first narrative is born, almost instinctively. The mind frames the divorce as an act of strength, a necessary rupture, a brave decision made in the name of self-respect and growth. I had to do this. I chose myself. I finally reclaimed my life. These statements are not lies. They are survival tools. At this stage, the narrative is less about honesty and more about psychological stabilization. Even if the marriage was deeply flawed, it still provided a framework, routines, shared responsibilities, a sense of direction. When that framework collapses, the nervous system panics. The story of empowerment steps in to prevent emotional free fall. It allows the woman to stand upright in the middle of chaos and tell herself that this destruction has a purpose. Without that meaning, the mind risks spiraling into regret, fear, and paralysis. So it chooses certainty over nuance, strength over ambiguity. Friends and family play a powerful role in reinforcing this story. They gather around with reassurance, often with the best intentions. You deserve better. You're so strong for leaving. This is a clean slate. Each sentence acts like a psychological painkiller. It dulls doubt. It quiets the inner voice that wonders if things could have been handled differently, or if something valuable was lost alongside what was broken. Social validation becomes a protective wall against second-guessing. As long as everyone agrees that the decision was right, the mind feels safe enough to keep moving forward. This collective affirmation, however, comes with a hidden cost. It discourages complexity. There is little room to admit conflicting emotions when the surrounding chorus demands confidence and relief. Regret becomes something to suppress, not explore. Grief is reframed as weakness instead of an expected response to loss. Over time, the woman may feel pressure to perform the role of the empowered survivor, even when parts of her are still mourning what was familiar and once meaningful. What begins as a coping mechanism slowly hardens into an identity. The story must be defended, repeated, and lived out publicly. And once the mind fully commits to this narrative, the emotional shift accelerates into a phase that feels intoxicating, almost euphoric, as if the future has suddenly burst open with endless possibility. This is where the next stage begins, and it is often the most celebrated, the most visible, and the most misunderstood part of the post-divorce journey. The euphoria stage begins quietly, then takes over with surprising force. Once the mind fully accepts the narrative of strength and liberation, a new emotional current rushes in. For the first time in years, there's a sense of total autonomy, no compromises to negotiate, no shared schedules to consider, no emotional temperature to monitor. Every decision feels personal again. This realization alone can be intoxicating. It feels like oxygen after a long period of emotional restraint, even if that restraint was subtle or normalized during the marriage. This stage often expresses itself through small but symbolic changes. Furniture is rearranged, walls are repainted, decor is updated. These actions are not just aesthetic, they are psychological markers. They signal a break from the old life and the creation of a new internal map. Many women suddenly join gyms, classes, or activities they had postponed or abandoned. Pottery, dance, language lessons, fitness programs, anything that represents movement and possibility becomes attractive. Each new habit reinforces the belief that a different version of life is now unfolding. Social energy explodes during this period. Invitations appear. Nights out multiply. Introductions happen organically. The calendar that was once shaped around family obligations and shared responsibilities fills with personal events and spontaneous plans. There is a sense of being seen again, not as a wife or part of a unit, but as an individual. This shift is especially powerful for women who spent years being primarily defined by their role in the marriage. Attention becomes a central force. Compliments feel sharper, more meaningful. Dating apps light up with matches. Conversations carry a flirtatious edge that had long been absent. Validation arrives from multiple directions, and the brain responds exactly as biology intended. Dopamine spikes, confidence rises. The nervous system interprets this attention as proof that the decision was correct. Social media amplifies the effect. Photos receive likes and comments that frame the woman as glowing, thriving, transformed. Each interaction reinforces the idea that she has rediscovered a version of herself that was suppressed or forgotten. This excitement is real. The joy is not imagined. But chemically and psychologically, it closely resembles a mild manic state. Novelty, pleasure hormones, and constant stimulation create momentum that protects the psyche from the deeper shock of loss. It is the body's way of buffering trauma, of keeping despair at bay through movement and stimulation. The danger is not in enjoying this phase, but in mistaking it for stability. Because underneath the rush, a different need is quietly forming, one that cannot be satisfied by attention alone. And as the initial high begins to normalize, small cracks start to appear in the foundation of validation itself. As the euphoria settles, the first cracks begin to show. Though they are easy to ignore at first, human beings are biologically wired to seek validation because, at a deep level, validation once meant survival in a long marriage. This validation is often quiet and layered. It lives in inside jokes, in being known without explanation, in the comfort of someone remembering how you take your coffee or sensing your mood without words. It is not loud, but it is dense. After divorce, validation does not disappear. It multiplies. The problem is that it changes in quality. Post-divorce validation becomes wide but shallow. It comes from friends, acquaintances, strangers, social media, and casual romantic interest. The sheer volume can feel overwhelming in a positive way. Compliments arrive more often. Invitations feel endless. Attention seems abundant. On the surface, this looks like an upgrade. But psychologically, the nervous system still craves depth, not noise. 100 likes cannot replicate the feeling of being deeply known by one person. 10 admirers cannot replace the quiet security of shared understanding built over years. Without realizing it, many women begin making choices based on external response rather than internal alignment. What gets praise is repeated. What draws attention is amplified, slowly. Life starts to feel like a performance for an invisible audience. The woman is not consciously pretending, but she is adapting to feedback loops that reward visibility, attractiveness, and apparent happiness. This creates a fragile dependency. When attention is present, confidence feels high. When it fades, anxiety quietly creeps in. This shift is exhausting. Even if the exhaustion is not yet fully felt, maintaining momentum requires constant stimulation. Plans must stay full, messages must be answered, posts must be crafted. There is little room for stillness, because stillness invites questions the mind is not ready to face. Silence threatens to expose the emotional gap between being wanted and being truly connected. At this stage, many women still believe they are thriving. The social proof is strong enough to support the illusion. But internally, the nervous system is beginning to register a mismatch. The validation feels good, but it does not settle. It excites rather than soothes. It lifts rather than anchors. This is the psychological groundwork for the next phase. When novelty thins, attention normalizes, and the emotional cost of constant stimulation becomes impossible to ignore. That moment does not arrive suddenly. It drifts in quietly, disguised as boredom, fatigue, or a vague sense that something is missing. The plateau stage usually arrives somewhere between 6 months and a year after the divorce. There is no dramatic crash, no clear turning point. Instead, the emotional intensity slowly levels off. The excitement that once felt endless begins to thin. New routines start to feel like routines rather than reinventions. The calendar is still full, but the energy behind it is different. What once felt like freedom now carries a subtle sense of repetition. Dating becomes one of the clearest mirrors of this shift. Conversations start to blur together. The same questions, the same jokes, the same carefully curated stories repeat with different faces. What once felt like possibility begins to resemble a loop. Modern dating, with its endless options, reveals its emptiness here. Being chosen over and over no longer feels meaningful when no one is truly choosing the whole person. Attention becomes hollow. There is a growing realization that being wanted is not the same as being valued, and attraction does not automatically lead to connection. Social events lose their sparkle. Gatherings begin to feel obligatory rather than energizing. Conversations circle around familiar topics without depth. Even support from friends starts to feel thin, not because they do not care, but because they cannot fully understand the internal complexity of this stage. At the same time, comparisons quietly begin. Moments from the past surface unexpectedly, not the worst moments that led to the divorce, but the good ones. Comfort, familiarity, shared language, and history appear in contrast to the emotional labor of starting from zero again. This contrast often triggers an identity crisis. For years, the role of wife shaped daily life, decisions, and self-perception. When that role disappears, freedom can morph into isolation. There is no one checking in by default, no shared life to return to at the end of the day. The absence is not dramatic, but it is constant. To escape this discomfort, many women throw themselves into self-improvement. Books are consumed, therapy is intensified, journals fill with reflections about growth, healing, and finding oneself. These efforts are often genuine, but they can also carry a quiet desperation to rebuild a sense of meaning as quickly as possible. Even social media shifts tone during this phase. Posts become more philosophical, more focused on journeys, lessons, and personal evolution. Authenticity itself becomes something to perform, as if convincing the audience might also convince the self. Yet, beneath all of this effort, a deeper reckoning is forming. The novelty has worn off, and the emotional cost of the decision is becoming harder to avoid. That reckoning is the next stage, and it is the one few people talk about openly. The reckoning stage tends to surface 1 to 2 years after the divorce, when the emotional safety nets have quietly disappeared. Friends assume the transition is complete, the excitement has long faded, the woman herself is expected to be fully moved on. Yet, internally, this is often the most destabilizing phase. The weight of the decision becomes impossible to bypass. The future that once felt wide open now feels heavy with unanswered questions. Dating during this period can provoke something close to revulsion. Promising beginnings fizzle quickly. Many men encountered feel emotionally unavailable, burdened by unresolved pasts, or locked into perpetual bachelorhood. Others seem interested only in the idea of a woman, not her complexity. High-quality men, the kind capable of building stable, long-term partnerships, appear rare when they do appear. An uncomfortable realization emerges. These men are usually drawn to ordered, grounded lives, and her own life may no longer feel that way. Practical realities add pressure. Single life is expensive. Financial adjustments become unavoidable. Housing may be smaller, budgets tighter. The abstract idea of freedom begins to erode under the weight of everyday responsibility. What once felt like independence now feels like carrying everything alone. Alongside this comes a deeper loneliness, one that has nothing to do with being surrounded by people. It is the absence of a person with whom life is shared. Not just the highlights, but the mundane, unglamorous moments that quietly create belonging. Memories begin to shift in tone. The mind softens the past. The worst moments of the marriage fade, while stability, shared history, and emotional safety rise to the surface. This psychological trick can be brutal. Encounters with the ex intensify it if he's moved on. Feelings of replacement and rejection surface if he struggles. Guilt and confusion take their place. Comparisons become relentless new dates against old good moments. Present loneliness against past security. Slowly, a question forms that was once unthinkable. What if the decision was a mistake? This question does not mean the marriage was healthy or should have continued. It means the woman has reached the point where illusions can no longer fully protect her from reality. And from here, the psyche must choose how to settle. Some choices offer growth, others offer comfort. All of them reveal something uncomfortable about human nature, and that is where the final phase takes shape. The settlement stage does not arrive as a single emotional conclusion. It emerges as a pattern of choices, and those choices tend to fall into a few familiar directions. Some women double down on independence. They build lives centered entirely around career, friendships, travel, and personal projects. Partnership is reframed as a limitation, even a weakness. This stance often looks empowered on the surface, but psychologically it can function as armor. By rejecting intimacy, the risk of disappointment is removed. Freedom becomes a defense rather than a desire. Others move in the opposite direction. After years of disappointment, they lower their standards and settle into relationships that feel good enough. These partnerships may offer companionship, but lack depth, respect, or real compatibility. The goal shifts from connection to avoidance of loneliness, ironically. These relationships can feel more confining than the marriage that was left behind. Yet they are tolerated because they quiet the ache of being alone. There is also a smaller group who reach genuine regret, not regret born from nostalgia alone, but from clarity. They recognize that the marriage, while imperfect, held value that was never fully explored. They see how communication, boundaries, or emotional maturity could have changed the outcome. These women sometimes reach out to their ex, suggesting a conversation, a coffee, or a tentative exploration of reconciliation. Sometimes it works, often it does not. Time, damage, and growth in different directions create barriers that cannot be undone. The attempt itself, however, reveals a painful truth. The grass was not greener. It was simply different, with its own costs and compromises. The uncomfortable reality is that divorce, while sometimes necessary and healthy, is not a cure for unhappiness. It exchanges one set of problems for another. Unresolved insecurities, communication patterns, and emotional wounds do not disappear with a change of scenery. They follow. Real growth comes not from external reinvention, but from internal examination. This kind of work is rare because it is slow, uncomfortable, and offers no immediate validation. Most people choose distraction instead, repeating the cycle in new forms. Divorce changes circumstances, not character. It rearranges the house but does not replace the person living inside it. Some women do the hard work and emerge transformed. Many circle the same phases, ending with quiet regret, realizing they were running from themselves, not their partner. The truth is rarely comfortable, which is why illusions are so tempting. But real psychological freedom lives in those darker corners we avoid. If you want unfiltered insight into relationships and human nature,